Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Price of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals where you can get updates on the channel, interact with the channel, and support the channel directly. For those who are supporting the channel directly, continued support keeps content like this coming. So, Keith, you were mentioning that there's a pivot going on with the Neocons, and they have this long game plan in mind. Now, you'd already predicted that the Neocons, I think 10 years ago, would pivot to the Democratic Party for reasons that you can get into. So, yeah, we're sort of interested in seeing what you have to say about this pivot they're doing.
Yeah, well, the neocons have responded in a very interesting way to the rise of Trumpism in the Republican Party. By neocons, I mean the actual neoconservative movement. And if you don't know what that is, just Google it. And then, there's the neocons proper, which is the actual movement. And then there are people that I call neocon adjacents, and a lot of those are these super hawks like John Bolton types. And then I guess there's the wider Neocon alliance, which more or less includes liberal internationalists like Victoria Nuland. Well, she's more of a neocon, but someone like Samantha Power, humanitarian hawk, all of that. So these are people, the neocons, who believe in a very aggressive foreign policy, hyper interventionist in foreign policy. Many of them have a special interest in Israel and eliminating competitors to Israel in the Middle East. And these people were the ones that were in charge of the George W. Bush administration. They were the architects of the war in Iraq and the war on terrorism. And they were also more or less behind the wars in Libya and escalating the war in Syria during the Obama era as well. But it's interesting to observe how these people have reacted to the rise of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump having made isolationist-like rhetoric popular again among Republicans. One thing they've done, of course, is as an obvious thing, they formed this Never Trumper movement among Republicans. Many of them have also gone back and rejoined the Democrats. And initially, the neocons were on the left end of the Democratic Party back in the 60s. They used to have a group called Social Democrats USA, which were basically social democrats with hawkish foreign policy views. And you see that nowadays when you see someone like Bill Kristol regularly making the rounds on MSNBC, and now John Bolton is doing the same thing, and George Will is doing the same thing. David Brooks, David Frum, all of these guys are either hardcore neocons or neocon adjacents, and they're going back and becoming friendly with the Democrats now. And then another thing they've done is some of them have tried to embed themselves in Trumpism, like the circle around Norman Podhoretz has done that. Norman Podhoretz was one of the founders of neoconservatism. He's very old now, but his son, John, is a Trumpist, supposedly. His son-in-law, Elliot Abrams, was actually Trump's envoy to Iran at one point. And that is significant because regime change war with Iran is really the holy grail for the neocons. That's probably their greatest of all ambitions. Another thing the neocons have done is they've created this thing called national conservatism. And that is in collusion with guys like Yoram Hazani. He's an American, but he's an Israeli citizen as well. He now lives in Israel. He's basically an Israeli nationalist. Also, Sohrab Hamari, who just a few years ago was writing praise to Norman Podhoretz in New York Post, which is a Murdoch magazine. It's the same people that run Fox. Now Hamari, who's a Pahlavistic, a supporter of the former royal family that ruled Iran prior to the current regime. And now he's also become one of the leaders of national conservatism. And the national conservatives tend to downplay some of the hawkish interventionist rhetoric of the neocons. They're trying to, it looks like to me that they're trying to create a type of Trumpism without Trump. That is, they're trying to co-opt Trump's movement and bend it in their own direction while bypassing Trump himself. In their circle includes a lot of former liberals turned conservative over wokeness, like a lot of your Dave Rubin types and walkaway types and those kinds of people. But they also include neo-reactionaries like Curtis Yarvin. They've even tried, I think, to bring some of the paleocons under their umbrella. I think that's a matter of keeping your enemies close. So the point being is that the neocons have created this multi-front opposition movement to Trump, which is standard. If you know anything about the background of the neocons, they have their roots in Trotskyism and Leninism, and this is a standard, communist vanguard party model where you create all these different front organizations and that you use to manipulate larger groups and larger movements, and then you create a fake opposition and things like that. I mean, that's anybody that's familiar with the history of Leninist organizational tactics understands how this works. So that's what the neocons have done in response to Trump. Now, I think right now what they're doing is they're trying to weaponize the January 6th incident as a means of purging Trump himself. It's not a coincidence that Liz Cheney is leading the Inquisition against Trump. She's one of the staunchest neocon allies in Congress. She's Dick Cheney's daughter. She has the same politics that he does. So that's not a coincidence that she's the leader of this. So they're trying to use J6 to purge Trump and his movement. Now, what they want to do, if that's successful, is they want to put in a replacement for Trump as the Republican front runner party candidate in 2024. And they're hoping it will be somebody who will be another George W. Bush. That is, somebody who's basically just silly putty in the hands of the neocons that they can puppet master. And they're grooming a lot of different guys for this. They're grooming Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley, some others. And I don't think they've settled on which one they want, but that's their purpose. That's what they're trying to do. They want another George W. Bush, but to do that, they need to purge the Trumpists first. Now, and of course, the goal is once they return to power, they want to launch a war with Iran, as well as expand the war in Ukraine, intensify the conflict with Russia, take a more confrontational stance with China and North Korea as well. John Bolton, for example, advocates all-out war with North Korea for real, a nuclear-armed country. And also, I think based on things I've seen in recent days, I think they have a plan B as well. I think that if the plan of purging Trump and then putting in a Bush clone as leader of the Republican Party, if that doesn't work, I've noticed in recent days that a lot of neocon allies, like these Rhino types and Never Trumper types, have now colonized Andrew Yang's Forward Party, which I think is very interesting because at the exact same time that is going on, Liz Cheney is dropping hints she may be running for president. And I suspect that the neocons have a plan where if they can't purge Trump and Trump runs again, they will launch a third party candidate of their own that could serve as a spoiler to keep the Trumpists from regaining power in the White House, which means they would throw the election to the Democrats because the neocons are more opposed to Trump than they are to the Democrats. Also, parallel to that, I've noticed that at the same time this is going on, the media is now really starting to push Pete Buttigieg as a preferred replacement for Joe Biden. There seems to be a lot of hints being dropped that Biden shouldn't run again. They need a replacement, and Buttigieg seems to be the front runner for that. The neocons, I think, would view Buttigieg as not ideal, but somebody they could work with because he has an intelligence background. He has a military background. Also, he's just an empty suit who would be totally malleable. He would be silly putty in their hands as well because he stands for nothing. So I think that's the neocon plan B. I think plan A is use January 6th to purge Trump and then put in another George W. Bush in the form of DeSantis, Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley, somebody. Or if that doesn't work, run a spoiler candidate and throw the election to the Democrats and then get a neoliberal in the White House that neocons who work through the Democratic Party, like Victoria Nuland, like the Kagan family, like other Democrats, there are neocons in both the Democrats and the Republicans. They're hoping they can work the Democratic angle instead. But the holy grail with these people is war with Iran. That's what they ultimately want. They want regime change war in Iran. They want to continue to try to eliminate Iran's allies in Iran, Hezbollah and Syria and the Houthis and all of that. And also, of course, they want to take a much more aggressively confrontational stance with the Eastern alliance with Russia, China, and North Korea, some of those countries. So that's, I think, ultimately what's going on as far as the neocon response to what's happening. I mean, I'm not saying this as a fan of Trump. I actually think Trump has some dangerously authoritarian tendencies. I think he would not mind at all being an Erdogan type figure, a de facto president for life, with this kind of maybe a facade of a democratic republic or something like that. So I'm not defending Trump. I'm just saying that the people who are looking to purge him are worse, and this is, I think, what they're trying to do.
Yeah. And when it comes to this like long game, so what you're saying, Keith, is they still want to eliminate the axis of evil members, which was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Now, we quote unquote got to Iraq, but we never got around to Iran and North Korea. What I think is really just kind of insane about all this, not that I think you're correct in your analysis of what's happening, but like I think we all remember during the Obama administration when the neocons were at an all-time low on popularity and everybody was like, bring the troops home from Iraq and, end the forever war. And it's like, how did everybody just forget? Like they just seem to have all forgotten, and we're getting ready for another forever war, this time instead of against Islamic terrorism. It's because I don't know, Russia, China, whoever. It's almost like we didn't remember. We don't. Now, I think what's really interesting here is, Kabul and Saigon have, obviously our natural connections to make. So after the fall of Saigon, we had, 15 years of what they called Vietnam syndrome, which was, the all-time low U.S. support for the military. And the war in the Gulf in 1990 was an attempt to reverse that. And it was largely been successful. And what's interesting is that there is no Afghanistan syndrome. Right? We had a humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan, televised, but there's no Afghanistan syndrome. And if anything, if you look at like Pew and other studies, the U.S. military is, of all government institutions, the most supported, which is crazy. This is the exact opposite of what happened in Vietnam. And they somehow managed to do it by manipulating the media. And I think part of it was getting everybody on social media. So rather than having real world interactions, you all interact in cyberspace. And since they control they have this controlling interests in government and business and whatnot, they can then determine reality. It's like that one George W. Bush advisor, we create our own reality. And so, social media allows you to do that. And that's one reason why these people are doing that, have been able to avoid a repeat of Vietnam syndrome. And really what this kind of reminds me of is this like, John Bolton type person, just give me a war, any war will do. It just kind of reminds me of like the Gallup and Gertie effect in World War I. All of these nations had well-funded, powerful militaries that were interested in, being used. And it was almost like, their own existence and then, some means to justify it was what they were seeking, right? The military-industrial complex. You've said before, Keith, would be the holy grail victory for any dissident in America if we could dismantle the military-industrial complex. And so it needs a reason to exist, right? During the Cold War, that reason was self-evident. It was the Soviet Union and international communism. And right now, I think it's just seeking all sorts of reasons to exist, because it doesn't really need to, however plausibly you might have been able to argue it needed to exist in the Cold War. It doesn't need to exist now. And that's really the issue of what's driving this. And I think it's like that saying, the bureaucracy expands to meet the needs of the bureaucracy. It doesn't do anything out of any long-term sense of planning or any sort of, principle justification. It just does it because it can and because it needs to justify its own existence. And I think what's really interesting here is that, again, all the critics of U.S. imperialism from the left have pretty much gone away. They're all silent. They're implicitly in favor of the war. I mean, recently in Ukraine, there was Slavoj Žižek was basically supporting the Ukrainians. And, there's been a whole bunch of, shifting and power plays on the online left. So the Young Turks are now hawks, and they've, distanced themselves from, other elements of the left that they were a part of. Obviously Max Blumenthal in the gray zone is sort of in the doghouse at this point. And of course, he's doing what the left had done for the last 20 years, reporting on U.S. imperialism. And so it is just incredible how dynamic the neocons are and how they were able to recover from such a crushing political defeat during the Obama years, when I think it was at all-time high, pull the troops home, stop the forever war. So Swithun, some of your thoughts.
I agree entirely, Todd, with respect to the current support for the military and war. As we discussed before, the anti-war left has sort of completely disappeared in its entirety. And the neocons and basically a lot of American politics has been determined by the military industrial complex and Wall Street. Those are the two, the Fed indirectly, not directly. And those are the institutions you really can't upset. Anything else is fair game to a large extent. So the alliance and movement that Keith mentions makes entire sense. You just get everyone to focus on, the whole woke stuff is hilarious as well. It's like all these sort of like who would be considered leftists 10 years ago. Oh, we're anti-woke. The TERFs. We'll get them on board as the anti-woke crowd. It's like, what? What? Some academic agent said, I can't remember which piece of legislation it was that DeSantis passed in Florida was considered this anti-woke thing. He read the text of it. It read exactly the same as Tony Blair's Equality Act of 20. Oh, sorry, no, it wasn't. No, that wasn't Blair, but it was. I think it was origins in Blair. It was passed in 2010 by. I think it was passed by Brown just before the coalition government in 2010. I can't remember the exact date, but it's a very Blairite document, which is essentially a compendium and a sort of rehash of all the anti-discrimination legislation. Of always said you've got to be even-handed and treat everybody equally again with these protected characteristics. This was heralded as some sort of woke, anti-woke document passed by DeSantis, which is something that Tony Blair would have passed like 15 years ago. So it's a complete. I'm always highly skeptical. Another example of this, someone who tried to stand for the Tory leadership in England, someone called Kemi Badenoch, was this anti-woke individual. She had the ministerial position for women and equalities. She actually had that document. It's like, if you're really anti-woke and you're really sort of conservative, surely you would never even take such a position. You'd want to abolish this position that somehow there's a women and equalities minister. That's just absurd. So I see this a lot even in the UK as well. There's a sort of like faux. It's a way of getting alongside the traditional vote without actually changing anything meaningful. It just allows some of the further left cultural stuff. You play that up and then get someone to oppose it. Which and the way you oppose it is basically what would be considered with general leftist approaches, say 10, 15 years ago, which is the way I see DeSantis amongst and others. Not the as he points out, the thing that the establishment were concerned about Trump was his foreign policy. That was the main thing. Even his protectionist stuff. Everyone forgets Obama whacked tariffs on China. They like trade, they like managed trade. They're far from ideologically free traders by any stretch of the imagination. So I think they could have accommodated Trump's foreign economic situation, or even his domestic one. It was his war situation. It was his position on war, which was the problem. If that's the main goal, we're keeping Wall Street in having the money-making capacity via the Fed or the Bank of England in England, and the war machine rolls on, the powers that be don't care, and it's just a case of choosing who is the most malleable to maintain that effort. And as we've seen, recently, that the left in particular pivoting towards supporting, the Ukrainians, somehow borders exist in Ukraine, but that's about it, nowhere else. And we have to support them at all costs and send more and more weaponry. It's just another great coup for, military arms contractors. So, yeah, it's just a case of play up a really lame version of the culture war, and not really change anything ultimately, and then just keep the main things, the money rolling in and the war going on. That seems to be definitely the tactic. And you reminded me, the axis of evil. Yeah, they're back and they're going to be gods. It seems pretty clear that that's what they intended to do.
Okay, Chairman of Philosophy.
Right. Well, at times it's sort of difficult to assess the precise state of neoconservatism. I will say, just as a brief retrospective comment, that Trump, by and large, is hated by the neocon sector of U.S. politics. He had made several concessions and favors to them by employing people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. He also moved the U.S.-Israeli embassy to Jerusalem, and he said most of the things that he had to in public in order to not rock the boat too much as far as the schism in the Republican Party is concerned. However, in practice, it's fair to say that Trump is not a neocon, despite sort of much of the wide-ranging speculation about Trump's foreign policy early on in his presidency. Trump did not manifest new wars, I would say, with the exception of ordering several Tomahawk missile strikes on Syrian military infrastructure, as well as the assassination of a high-ranking Iranian general. Firing John Bolton was an event that distanced Trump from the neocons. Also, as Keith has sort of alluded to earlier, many establishment Republicans like the late John McCain and Romney and others made it clear that they were not associated with Trump's brand of politicking. Neocons dislike most appeals to a more isolationist U.S. president, and they prefer more of an active and ongoing policy apparatus in the Middle East. It should be no surprise to anyone that the neocons are heavily pro-Israeli, and many of them in Bush Jr.'s cabinet were dual citizens of the United States and Israel. A great documentary that I can't recommend enough to everyone listening here is a three-part documentary called The Lobby, which was released by Al Jazeera about probably 7 or 8 years ago, and it details basically just how intensely the Israeli lobby pressures the United States to favor a more pro-Israeli foreign policy. Much of Trump's discourse before he ran for office was, very anti-war and anti-establishment. And so this was perfect timing for many apolitical voters who didn't understand the war, didn't support it, and they wanted something to be done against the corruption of the so-called elite or the swamp, whatever you want to call it. As for my own thoughts about the possibility of Trump's rejection by a broader Republican or neoconservative base in Washington, I think the Republican Party knows it would be a risky move to pursue such a strategy. Trump was a very popular president amongst the Republican voting base, and any self-evident move to keep him out of politics could backfire on them in ways that are difficult to calculate at this time. In addition to this, there is now a sort of a smaller phenomenon known as the Trump candidate, or you could also call this more broadly Trumpism. This is basically a shorthand way of referring to a local or more state level political candidate, like a congressman or a mayor. This term basically indicates a politician who is more sympathetic to Trump's policies and a focus on domestic issues. This is basically the antithesis to the more international focused, big spending variety of republicanism. That would be more associated with the neocon apparatus. I think if the Republicans go full anti-Trump, I think it would be largely because of the momentum they are enjoying in the culture war, as more apolitical normie types are noticing the sort of ubiquitous condescension that comes with the woke cultural impacts on just discourse, entertainment, sports, and other things. They're probably weighing the possibilities as to whether or not they need Trump to properly thwart or discredit wokeism, more broadly speaking. Another reason they might go full anti-Trump is basically to reopen the possibilities of the neoconservative goal, which is to meddle in the Middle East and elsewhere. I can imagine many establishment Republicans are friendly to the Bush era, with individuals like Scooter Libby and Paul Wolfowitz. Bill Kristol and others who helped draw up the plans for the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions. I think the last comment I'll say here is that I think it's clear that the Republican Party, much like the Democrats, they're suffering a kind of identity crisis. There's a whole host of domestic and foreign problems that are difficult for both neocons and I guess you could call them America First advocates, to sort of diligently grapple with all these issues. How each of those categories are addressed could easily tank local or national elections, and this could be in the form of discouraged, spiteful voters just simply not showing up. And I would have to agree with Keith because he made a point earlier where war with Iran has always been the holy grail of the Neocon political project. I don't remember the specific name of the paper, but I think General Wesley Clark, sometime in the mid 2000s, I think this is probably sometime around, well, it's actually early 2000s. I think it's probably around like 2002 or 2003, in which he detailed, it was either a leaked paper or basically just a piece of information from the Office of Special Plans of the Pentagon, which detailed a list of countries that various people, lobbyists and generals and CIA employees and other folks, at the top were interested in invading for regime change. And of course, this was all not completely at the behest, but quite heavily at the behest of Israeli foreign policy and the Likud party. So, I think I'll just leave my initial comments at that.
Right. So before I hand this over to you, Keith, what do you think of certain rumors that have been circulating that Trump and DeSantis are going to run together in 2024? And if that's true, how does that affect your predictions? No, you're muted, Keith.
I think that Trump would only consider that as a means of neutralizing DeSantis. Like, I think if he realized, okay, this guy's going to beat me in the primaries if I don't make him my vice president, there's a good chance of that. I think Trump might try to bring in DeSantis as his running mate. I mean, he's not going to bring Pence back. That's pretty clear. But I could see Trump trying to make DeSantis his running mate as a means of neutralizing him. But the thing is, Trump is only going to do that if he thinks there's a really good chance DeSantis is going to beat him. But if DeSantis thinks there's a good chance that he could actually win, then that's what he's going to go for. I think that DeSantis seems to be trying to walk the middle between not alienating the Trump people, but not being overly tainted with being a Trumpist. So I think the only way he would throw himself onto the Trump bandwagon completely would be if he thought that was his main chance. If he thought, the Donald is going to get reelected, and if I'm his vice president, then I could succeed him. I think DeSantis would have to view it that way as his best chance before he would ever accept that position, because those two guys are enemies. It's clear they don't like each other. But I could see Trump trying to neutralize DeSantis by asking him to be his running mate. But if Trump is motivated to do that, then I think DeSantis is going to know something's up. So,
right. So, Swithun, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that Trump is ego over everything else, and so DeSantis has got a bit of a limelight at the moment, so you want to avoid him if possible. But if it's a case that he wins by using him as a running mate, then of course that's what he'll do. But DeSantis is a politician, seems like he wants to get to the top, so it would go the other way. I think with Trump, the most interesting thing is if he does become the Republican nominee, and suppose he becomes president, the question is, what does Trump do? He can only have one term. Will he do what he basically said he'd do the first time round and just go, I don't care, I'm going in 4 years anyway, I can do what I want? And will he actually turn the tables over? Or will he try and ingratiate himself back with the movers and shakers to sort of have a better sort of sort of image amongst the chattering classes. I don't know. I think that would be very interesting to see how that would work. And then, of course, if he was to be somewhat more aggressive in scaling back wars or bringing troops back, as to whether or not he'll have a health episode and have to resign at some point, or maybe even die in office, because I do think that would definitely be an option if necessary. But Trump is fundamentally unideological and in it for himself, so I think he'd probably realize that might happen to him, and so therefore decide that it's probably not worth doing so. But I do think it would ultimately be very interesting to see what he did do, because if he did do what he said he would do, in sort of the campaign trail and things, you would get a relatively radical presidency. Although whether it would work, I mean, you'd have all the permanent bureaucracy ready to fight against him in a way that they weren't beforehand. So even if he does attempt to do it, they'll be probably in better form to counter his moves. But we shall see. So yeah, that's what I can usefully add, I think, at present.
All right, Terminal Floss.
Yeah, I agree with Keith. I have a hard time imagining that DeSantis and Trump would be running mates. I think there's just too much animosity there already. And currently, I mean, it's sort of hard to read the tea leaves, but I'm currently persuaded that Trump's popularity just with Republican voters, as well as probably a portion of the pie chart of centrists and more apolitical types, I just think that he'd have this wrecking ball effect in the primaries, and he would get the nomination again. Assuming that's, let's just say, as a hypothetical, that he did secure, the candidacy. I'm curious to see how Trump, if he would be a bit more careful and surround himself with a few more establishment types. But I have a difficult time imagining Trump and DeSantis, I don't know, running together. It just doesn't seem very possible right now. And I think too, Trump wouldn't have to put in that much effort to communicate to people that DeSantis is just this, blank slate sort of puppet that could be molded however the establishment wants him to be. Trump would just sell DeSantis to the public as just another neocon establishment figure or a rhino or something like that. So, assuming that Trump gets he does get the nomination from the Republican Party, I can imagine that he'd be a bit more careful, but the backlash from the neocons I could see would be pretty bad because, once again, you have to consider that the public, the United States public, we are just completely exhausted with war, and I don't know how the neocon apparatus would jujitsu the public to go to war with Iran, pending some sort of black flag trickery or some sort of operation like that. But I just see Trump at the moment. He's just too popular, and I just see him capturing the nomination for the Republicans.
When it comes to the war goals of the neocons and the ability to gain political power at home to then project military power abroad, you had already mentioned earlier in this conversation, Keith, that there's a lot of domestic issues that both the neocons and the Democrats and the Republicans are just really completely unqualified to deal with, in part because it falls outside of the scope of their framework of thinking. And I think that's the actual interesting question, right? Because whether the neocons are successful in this regard, I think depends on what ends up happening in, Main Street America, as the saying was during Occupy Wall Street. Because the idea was if you just have these people living in a bubble, like, Russian aristocrats in 1917, it's like, what is that going to actually look like? Because you can say, well, okay, they control the media outlets. Yes, so did the Tsar. They control, large parts of the military. So did the Tsar. And yet, because he was isolated from events on the ground, there was a revolution that got rid of him. And so the question is, how much does the reality on the ground getting worse for Main Street America, affect this neocon plan? Because, when people are like, I think it was something you said, Keith, when like getting bread is like, your food is like 40 to 50% of your budgetary spending, then you have a revolution because people are just like, well, we need to eat, anything else just doesn't matter. And the question is, they've been taking the let them eat cake route, right? Biden says gas prices are going to be high. Deal with it. We got to beat Russia. So the idea being is they're already going down the road of the, the Bourbons, let them eat cake. And so the question is, I think, even if they could attain these political victories, and again, that's a big if. We don't know what 2024 holds and what a Trump campaign would do. But even all that aside, how fast do you think things are moving on the ground that will make a lot of this just moot?
Well, I think the neocons are hoping they can weaponize all of that as well. I think they're hoping that first they can use J6 to purge Trump. They're probably, in fact, I'm sure they're hoping that Merrick Garland is going to at some point bring criminal charges against Trump and distract Trump with legal issues. And then they're hoping that they can have, their DeSantis or their Rubio or whomever as their new front man. And that then I'm sure that the neocon strategy would be to try to weaponize the economy and the unpopularity of the Biden administration, and also anti-wokeism. That's getting a lot of mileage right now. And I think the neocons, if they are able to successfully eclipse Trump and have one of their own candidates in 2024, I'm sure that's what they're going to run on: the economy and Biden's no good and anti-woke. And the Democrats are playing right into that, as you were saying, Todd. I mean, they pretty much adopted the classic Marie Antoinette line, only instead of let them eat cake, it's let them drive Teslas or something like that. So we know what happens to ruling classes that have that kind of attitude. And in fact, I think that's another reason why the neocons are more opposed to the Trumpists than they are to the Democrats, because they view the Democrats as, well, they're blowing it anyway, so who cares? We can beat them or co-opt them or whatever we need to do. But what I think is interesting, back to some of the points that were made earlier by Terminal Philosophy and some others, I think it's interesting to look at Trump's actual foreign policy record and his domestic record as well. On most issues, he was a normal Republican. In fact, on Middle East issues, he was extremely pro-Israel. He gave Netanyahu a blank check. He's very pro-Saudi, which is Israel's ally in the region. He gave MBS a blank check. As was pointed out, he moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. He did all of that. He created this Sunni Zionist alliance and the Abraham Accords that Jared Kushner put together. So you would think the neocons would love this guy, but because he stopped short of an actual war with Iran, and he continued to greenlight the Saudi war in Yemen even, but because he stopped short of actual war with Iran, yeah, he assassinated Soleimani, but that's just one guy. He called off the bombing raid that at one point was planned. Because of that, he's not good enough. And that's why guys like Bolton turned on him. Because even though he was extremely hawkish on all these issues, he wasn't enough for the neocons. Also, North Korea too. I think they were really angry about his relationship with Kim Jong-un. So that's how extreme the neocons are. In other words, anything less than full-blown war with particularly Iran, but maybe some other places as well, is unacceptable to them. And this has been their plan going back to at least the 90s. Way back in the 90s, the Project for a New American Century, which was led by Bill Kristol, drew up a plan for a series of regime change wars in different Middle Eastern and African countries. And then that was the plan after 9/11. And then they got to some of those. They got to Iraq, they got to Afghanistan, they got to Libya. They tried Syria. Iran was like the last on the list, and that was the Holy Grail, and they still haven't gotten there yet. And that's what they're so frustrated with. And I think that's their goal. I mean, I think the neocons are hoping they can purge Trump. They're hoping they can have DeSantis or somebody like that as their man, that they can weaponize the economy, anti-Bidenism, and anti-wokeism as a means of putting another George W. Bush in the White House. And DeSantis is going right along with this. Some time ago, DeSantis tweeted out that he wanted to be the most pro-Israel governor ever. Now, what does Israel have to do with being a governor? What does being a governor have to do with foreign policy? Well, to him a lot, because he knows who butters his toast. It's clear that that's what DeSantis has his sights on. He wants to be the U.S. president. He knows who he's got to please to do that. And there are others that want to do the same thing. Rubio was one. He was originally Bill Kristol's favorite back in 2015 when the Republican primaries were going on. There's Tom Cotton. He's a big neocon brown noser. There are others. That's where the neocons are coming from. Now, as far as what we've seen going on with the Democrats and with the left and with liberal opinion, as far as their hawkishness on Ukraine and all of that, I do think that is a really interesting development as well. When the $40 billion was recently sent to Ukraine, every single Democrat in both houses of Congress voted for that. Even the furthest left ones, even AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, every one of them, Cori Bush. In recent days, there was a vote on whether or not to admit Finland and Sweden to NATO. Same thing. Every single Democrat in the House, even the furthest left ones, voted for that. The only people who voted against it were a handful of Republicans. It was the Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz types. And the same was true with Ukraine aid. It was 57 Republicans voted against that, and it was the same coterie of hardcore Trumpists. And I think in the Senate it was Rand Paul basically had some issues with that. Maybe Tom Massey. I don't know. I don't remember the exact voting count. But that right there is what the neocons want to get rid of in the Republican Party. They see these anti-interventionist Republicans as the main obstacle to the things that they want to accomplish. I think that's why they now hate the Trumpists worse than they hate the Democrats. They're like, well, we're bringing the Democrats over to our side. We need to get rid of these neo-Taft Republican types. And as for why the left has gone that way, I think it has to do with ideological and geopolitical considerations. And with the Vietnam War, the what are commonly called the chattering classes or the cultural elite or the wine and cheese crowd, they were all very opposed to the Vietnam War. Well, for one thing, there were more casualties on the American side in the Vietnam War. That's what turned the public against it. But I think, though, that a lot of the left-wing anti-war movement from the 60s was not so much anti-war as much as it was pro-communism, and meaning that they viewed the Vietnamese as fighting colonialism and imperialism. And, they viewed Marxists as basically liberals in a hurry. And they had a much more, the Viet Cong cause was much more sympathetic from the point of view of the liberal worldview. Now, liberals have now become the hawkish party. I mean, to the degree that there are any doves in Congress now, they're all Republicans to a person. And I think the reason for that has to do with the way that the war on terrorism was framed, and now the conflict with Russia and China is being framed in the sense that you're not going to get too many leftists who are going to be that sympathetic to the Taliban. Social justice and anti-imperialism, medieval theocracy, no. And I think that, and we started to see that even after 9/11. We started to see a lot of people with strong left backgrounds like Christopher Hitchens suddenly, Christopher Hitchens used to be like Noam Chomsky, but then he did an about face and became a big supporter of Paul Wolfowitz. That was incredible. So I think now the left doesn't see war as imperialism versus anti-imperialism. Instead, they see it as more like World War II. They see it as anti-fascism. like with Afghanistan and the war on terrorism and all that. They're fighting Islamofascism, and now with Putin, they're fighting Russian fascism. The left looks at Russia as this reactionary, conservative, white, Christian, homophobic country that is fascist. That's like the headquarters of world fascism. And the idea of restoring the Tsarist Empire doesn't quite have the appeal as worldwide, workers of the world unite or something like that. So I think that's why you see the left becoming the hawkish party that they are today. Almost to a person. I mean, I'd say the anti-war left today is like the smallest sector of the left. Those sectors of the left has largely disappeared. I mean, like even somebody like AOC, if you look at what she's all about, it's just all about, well, to the degree it's about anything except getting herself on Twitter. It's about it's all about the environment, green this and rainbow this and ID Paul this and all that kind of stuff. So there really isn't an anti-war left anymore. I think the left today looks at it like we've got to fight fascism. So whether it's Trumpian fascism or Islamofascism or Russian fascism or Chinese fascism or whatever. So that's where all that stands.
All right, Swithun.
Keith's comments interesting with respect to Trump's actual foreign policy. He was very pro-Israel. That's true. But as TP said out, he wasn't as aggressive as he could have been. I think if he was to come in again, he would very much retain his very, very, very pro-Israel stance. Now, the question arises there is whether or not that would necessarily come into conflict with Iran, Iran or not. I suspect Trump would attempt to placate the Israelis, probably by recognizing more territory of theirs or trying to negotiate some sort of pro-Israel additional settlement with the West Bank Arabs or something on the Gaza or something on those lines. But I imagine he would attempt to scale back the Ukrainian expedition. I don't know, possibly going to talk to Rocket Man again. He seems to enjoy doing that. But the military, but whilst he didn't start any new wars, I mean, the American military as it currently stands in its operations in various places, including Somalia, amongst others. If everyone forgets, the Americans are still operating quite openly in Somalia, amongst other places. He really still isn't Ron Paul. Despite having some more charisma and a bit more brash about him, what he was going to do, his policy was different. I do think it was different, but the extent to which that makes a massive difference is another question. But it is true, as Keith pointed out, that the anti-war left basically doesn't exist, and they are the most pro war as you can get these days. Todd mentioned the Tsar, things on the ground, whether that'll mess them up. I think it will to some extent, but you've got to remember though, the Tsar with the control of the media outlets and stuff in the early 20th century is absolutely nothing compared with controlling media outlets today. I mean, prior to the radio and television, I mean, controlling the media involved possibly reading a newspaper every day. That would be the extent of it, or maybe not one on Sunday. I mean, today you have an all-encompassing media that Joseph Goebbels would have been very pleased to have control of. So I do think that it's hugely. I mean, just for instance, historically, would you have been able to switch on a dime from coronavirus is killing the entire world, everyone must stay home and stay safe, to Putin has ended coronavirus by invading Ukraine?
No, you could, because Stalin was our ally in World War II, and now he's the evil demon taking over the world.
Oh, well, they did change that relatively quickly. That is true. I would have to look historically, but I still think it is the case that you have more power now than you did than there. And it would be interesting to see comparative with the Zara situation, because you do have a lot of technological development in post the early 20th century, pre 1950. So will events on the ground? I mean, obviously, if the economic situation gets really, really bad, but given the technological process, I mean, the chances of, well, you might do, but the fact that nobody really knows anybody else as well as they used to, whether any organization amongst the disaffected, unemployed, etc., in a way that would have happened historically, is possibly a little less. So, well, a lot less. So whether they can meaningfully organize to sort of make any large-scale difference is another question, especially if they attempt to organize but the media just simply doesn't report on it, or if they do say, oh no, they're all a bunch of MAGA white nationalist types, look at all these rednecks, uncouth types, which is what they would probably do. If anything is anti-establishment, if it looks reasonable, you just don't report on it. And if there is an angle you can go, they're insane, you will. And that's the only thing the media will do of anything that is opposed to their general worldview. So, yeah, those are my eclectic thoughts on the matter.
All right, TP.
All right, well, there's a few things to respond to. First of all, I'm not sure what happened to my Harrison Ford icon. Apparently, that's only showing up in the StreamYard, but I guess he's been negated for now. Anyway, the initial question was that, if the state of Main Street in the United States is so dire, then what does this, what does that imply for these Neocon foreign adventures? Well, I think, if anything, it should really underscore just like the immense hubris that a lot of neocons have had in the United States for such a long time. I think it's one thing to be a think tank neocon figure in Washington, D.C., and it's a completely other thing to, be living in a dirty, crowded city paying $1,400 a month for a 700 square foot apartment. So, these people, I really do honestly believe that they're detached from reality. And sometimes, when you're laying in bed at night and you're thinking, what are the elites up to? And, are they these, hyper capable, highly, coldly calculating master planners, and it's all going to plan? I tend to actually think the opposite. I tend to think that just most of our leaders are just wildly incompetent. They only have short-term goals and the immediate and vague long-term goals. Looking at this from a military strategist point of view, if the neocons were poised, well, and they certainly are, the neocons are absolutely poised to, for regime change in Tehran. If there was a time to do it, it would have been years ago when the United States had troops stationed in Afghanistan and Iraq, where you can sort of open up this Western and Eastern front on Iran. And now that, Afghanistan was a embarrassing shit show, let's just call it what it is. And we have, I guess, who knows how many troops we have in Iraq now. And I think there are still some troops stationed in eastern Syria, but that would have been the time to do it. And so now, looking at, the drawing board, or, if you're going to treat the world as a Sid Meier civilization game as a neocon, how do you get, American infantry and armored divisions back in the Middle East? Well, a lot of this bizarre trickery sometimes, and I don't mean to go too far out into the territory of conspiracies, but there are a lot of peculiar black flag operations. I don't have to tell anyone here, I'm sure, about the USS Liberty in 1967. And there was also the smaller incident when, I can't remember which specific year, but when Trump was in office, there was, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but a Japanese fuel tanker that was either taken over temporarily by the Iranians or it was shot at by drones. I apologize that I don't have those specific details right in front of me. But that created quite the amount of hyperbole and drama in the mainstream media. There's all this sort of speculation about, well, what does this mean about going to war with Iran? And then, of course, idiots like John Bolton and all these other, war hawks are on CNN and all these other legacy media outlets advocating for some type of contingency operation against Iran. And so, but obviously it was bad timing because, by the time that incident had happened to that tanker, I mean, and it's the same cases as at this very moment that, again, the American public's approval for, going to war, yet a third time against Iran, which has, that is just not going to fly. And will one or both of these political parties want to pay the political consequences of doing that? I don't know, but it seems like the neocons are willing to sacrifice any political body or any individual or anyone, so as long as they can, keep waging and meddling within the Middle East. So yes, I mean, Trump is just he's a second time around, assuming he won the election in 2024. And I don't know, it's just difficult to say, but again, just coming at this from being a student of military history, would the United States have troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, that would have been the time to move in, regardless of how popular or unpopular that would have been. That just makes more sense in terms of logistics and deployments and all that. So, yeah.
All right, Keith, final thoughts.
Yeah, terminal philosophy raised some good points there. I think that if there was actually going to be a war with Iran, I have some idea how they would probably try to frame that. First of all, they would make a big deal about Iran supposedly acquiring nuclear weapons. We've got to get to them before they get to us with the nukes. Same thing they did with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They'd also say Israel's our greatest ally. The Iranians want to nuke Israel. I would certainly think they would try to create some false flag operations. In fact, there are at least two that I think they did during Trump's time in office that would stir up public opinion against Iran. Another thing, too, is I think more and more they're trying to farm out military operations in the Middle East to client states in the region. As far as I could tell, Trump basically outsourced the Syrian war to the Turks. And the Abraham Accords, a big part of that was creating this kind of Sunni Zionist alliance against the Iranians, because the way that the political alignments are shaping up in the Middle East today, you've got a three-way fight going. You've got the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated countries, which are mostly Turkey and Qatar on one end. You've got the Iranian resistance bloc on the other end, and that's Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Lebanon, the Houthis. Hamas is part of that, some others. And then you've got the Saudi, the Gulf state alliance with Israel. Now, two of those three are also a collection of client states of the United States. And I think that while the three hate each other, I think the Americans are trying to weaponize two of them against the third one. And it's quite possible that if there was a war in Iran, they would try to plan it out more like the first Gulf War, where the way they framed the first Gulf War is that this is not the United States going to war with Iraq. Oh, no. We're liberating Kuwait, and we're doing it as part of an international coalition. This is just one big peacekeeping mission. And they would point out the number of Syrian troops or the number of Egyptian troops or Jordanian troops or whatever that were involved in the war in 91. Interestingly, they kept the Israelis out of that because they knew that wasn't going to fly in the in the Arab world. So I think it's quite likely they would try to structure it in that way. It wouldn't be like '03 where it's a full-scale American invasion. They would probably do it more like 91, where it's a lot of American airstrikes. But as far as the boots on the ground, they try to use all of these proxy states as a means of carrying that out. Now, I don't think it would work. I think it would produce horrible results. It would be Iraq writ large. And if they were serious about it, they would have to put in American troops at some point. And they might well do that. They might say, well, we tried, but we got to send in troops now. But I do think that this is the plan. This is the end game. It's been the end game for decades with these people. And it's pretty clear that they're trying to use various mechanisms to try to return to power with the goal of carrying out some of these objectives.
All right. Final thoughts with.
I think it's going to be an interesting thing if they do get a Neocon man in place, and whether or not they do manufacture, or I do think he's probably right with the way in which they would go about doing it. Although not great to end on the question is, one interesting thing to consider is, why did the Neocons? Well, no, the Neocons are so concerned about Iran because of Israel. I answered my own question. It will be interesting happens, and then the thing with thereafter is, if Iran does go, do they go more on China or what else? Because the American Defense Department always needs someone to defend overseas. And with that, I'll finish.
Okay, Terminal Floss.
All right. Well, I guess just some closing thoughts is that, Keith made an interesting point that, nowadays the neocons might be looking for opportunities where they don't necessarily need a full corps or a large portion of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps and Air Force and Navy to make this happen. However, there's a good channel on YouTube called Vinkov's Battlegrounds, I believe, which is hosted by a Eastern European Slavic guy with like a hand puppet. It's kind of funny, but all he does is just analyze hypothetical wars between one country and another. And there's been several episodes where he sort of looks at the logistics and sort of numbers and belligerents involved in a U.S. versus Iran hypothetical war. And while it's true to say that, when you look at the casualties that were produced from Afghanistan and Iraq, just from the United States alone, they're very, very low compared to previous wars of the 20th century. Very low. However, I think the tolerance for casualties in the United States and NATO is much lower. And, just some logistical context for that is that in 2004, during the invasion of Iraq, it was something like $1.1 million to train every average infantryman, or at least a Marine infantryman. Who knows what it might be nowadays? And so I'm not saying the United States doesn't tolerate high casualties because of the cost, but I think they do it in general because of a sort of abstract fatigue in an attitude towards war, because we've just been at war since 2001, or we've been in the Middle East since 2001. And, the national debt has doubled in our lifetime. We're up to $30 trillion now, and much of that is military spending. So it's psychotic to imagine that we would somehow find ourselves in a war. But I think Keith's idea that they would pitch it as another peacekeeping mission, just like WMDs in Iraq. I think that would be probably the go-to in their playbook. However, in a hypothetical war between the United States and Iran, the casualties would be much higher on the United States. We're absolutely favored to win technologically and on a bunch of in various other categories. But you have to remember that Iran has a large standing army and air force, and has invested a lot in more advanced anti-air systems and artillery systems. And Iran is quite a bit larger than Iraq, and with the varying terrain, and there's just so many factors that would make it quite a slugfest. And whether or not America is willing to do that in order to carry out this neocon foreign policy is kind of frightening. But and I can't imagine the United States would go into Iran with a coalition like they did in Iraq in 2004, or a much larger and more solid, a coalition of high solidarity like it was in 1991 during the Persian Gulf. So that is just difficult to imagine. And let's just hope it doesn't happen. And I think I'll just leave my thoughts at that.
All right. Thank you, Terminal Philosophy, Swithun Dobson, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.